Hello, I'm Timashan and my student number is 2022795, and in this video we are going to talk about 4 paradigms using an application. The 3 languages that I've used are Java, SQL and XML. This application is developed using the IDE, IntelliJ IDEA, and the database that I'm using for this application is SQLite, and these are the 3 tables that I've created for it. And we are in its login page. This is an application that I've developed for a software company so that they can update and keep their clients on track. First, I'll give a quick tour into the application. So dashboard is by default the first panel, and it displays every project relevant to each client, and for each project you can leave a feedback if it's completed. Now we are looking at the feedback form. The administrator can adjust the answers to the questions, whether to be a slider or some radio buttons. The admin page shows all the online and offline users. The activity panel is where all the responses that you get from your clients are summed up and converted into a chart. The profile panel allows you to modify your profile information. The settings panel allows you to change your theme. You can even modify the graph if you want to. There are 3 web external APIs that I'm using for this application, and the most noticeable one is the quote API. Its job is to randomly fetch a quote whenever it's refreshed. And the most important one is the chart API. It's actually quickchart.io that generates a chart based on the values that we feed it. And if you look at the admin panel to see how the application fetches the IP address of the user, it's done by the IP5 external API. There are 4 libraries that I've used. All of the JFX GUI components that I've used for this application are from the JFinix library. The reason for this library is because, in my opinion, I think that the Java FX GUI components are pretty outdated. The SQL library is important when writing SQL statements because it helps me see them correctly. Also, the JSON library as well as the Commons.io library are equally important because they are used in the quote class to convert the JSON file into a readable state. Now let's talk about paradigms. So the first paradigm that we're going to talk about is virtual identity. Virtual identity is the integration of oneself in the online world. So in basic terms, that means this application should be able to differentiate its users. So it's done by assigning a role to each and every registered user. If we look at the profile table, we can see 3 different users with 2 distinct roles, which are admin and client. Now, in order to show the difference, I'll try to log in as an administrator. So we are back in the admin UI. So same as before, we are left with 5 panels, and if we take a look at the profile panel, we can see that the role tag, this should be the role tag, and it says admin. We'll do the same thing, but this time as a client. Now you can see that the UI is different because it only has 3 panels excluding admin and activity. And if we look at the profile panel, now the role tag is client. Code wise, it's done through 2 classes, and those 2 classes are login control and data source. So what happens in login control is that it will try to take all the input given by the user using the JFX text field, and it will transfer those inputs into the data source class, which is the class that the application uses in order to speak to its database. And it will try to recognize the user and remind the login control about the previously assigned role, and the UI will adjust according to user's needs. Since the database uses an SQL database, it belongs to the relational database paradigm. Now I didn't create a registration page for this application because since this is a application which is used by the clients of a software company, a registration page can be negligible because there won't be a mass amount of users, and there can be a security risk from bot attacks. So the admin has to do everything to the database, like register users, manage projects and everything. But a rather better solution would be to allow users to register as users but not as clients. So the admin will be able to mass delete all the users if they are the incorrect clients. User verification can be another alternate. Another problem with the current version is that it can be SQL attacked, and this can be avoided using prepared statements in the data source class. The next paradigm that we're going to talk about is event driven. So event driven is the flow of program execution according to a series of events. These events can be either buttons, toggle buttons, radio buttons, and so on. In an application, it's the GUI that makes event driven possible. So there are many types of GUIs that can be used in Java. Some of them are AWT Spring, and the one that we are using here is JavaFX. In JavaFX, we get a XML file as well as a controller, which is a Java file attached to it. Whenever I'm clicking any of these buttons, I'm obviously changing the execution of the program. That is what event driven is. And again, this is done by using the fxml file as well as the controller. Fxml file is the GUI layout, and you can define any buttons, toggle buttons, any node that you want, and you can use an on action next to the button, and you can define the method in the controller and give it some functionality. The reason why I use JavaFX over Swing is because JavaFX is very updated. It has many bugs fixed, and it uses observable lists for performance reasons. And when you look at Android, it uses a similar procedure in order to build up its GUI as well. Let's move on to the next paradigm, which is object orientation. It is the foundation of Java, and it is based upon the concept of objects. In short, it's called OOP. OOP has four basic principles, and they are inheritance, abstraction, encapsulation, and polymorphism. So when a subclass inherits the features of superclass, it's known as inheritance. Abstraction is a declaration without an implementation. Encapsulation is the method of hiding internal representations or state from the outside. And lastly, polymorphism. It is the concept of performing an action in many different ways. Let's take a look at the user class, a very simple class. In the user class, you can see that the variables are private variables, and you get a constructor which is performing encapsulation, because you can create an object of the user class in another class and perform its functions. You can see getters and setters at the bottom of the class. That's because the variables of this class are private, not public, and to access them you need getters and setters or a constructor. Polymorphism can be seen throughout the application when we look for overridden methods like the initialization method, and it's the first method to load up in each controller, and it plays a special part so we can modify it the way we want, and that's polymorphism. There are other alternatives for object orientation programming like procedural oriented programming, data oriented programming, compression oriented programming, and some more. The last paradigm that I'm going to talk about is interoperability. So it is the ability of one system to communicate or understand the interfaces of another system. Now, the two systems that I'm going to use here is the same application because it's capable of acting as a client as well as a server. I'm going to restart the application, log in as an administrator, visit the admin page. It shows that the admin as online. What if I came online as a client at the same time? And if I just refresh the page, now we see two users online. Now if a user leaves and if I refresh the page again, the admin page should show you that the user just went offline. So the code behind this is that whenever an administrator comes online, the server gets initialized, and if it's a client, the program will send a disconnect or a connect function to the server, and the server will try to interpret that, and it will show you in admin page. A good example of language interoperability is between Java and Kotlin, because they both produce a similar bit code that can be run by a JVM compiler. The network API that I'm using is server-side API. I'm more familiar with it, and it's more thread safe compared to RMI API, but the main difference between RMI and server socket API is that RMI is a high level API where server socket is a low level API. Thank you.